Welcome everyone to the new lecture on the No Man's Land webinar on pre-modern Islamic manuscripts. My name is Bruno de Nicola, and I am the PI of this project that is based here at the Institute of Iranian Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. For those that are new to this webinar, so normally we have a lecture first of around 40 to 45 minutes, followed by question and answers that we will go over for as much as is needed without trying to make it on time for dinner for home. For the Q&A, you can post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, which is an option you have at the bottom of your screen, and then we can read out loud to our speaker the different questions you may have. So we will record this lecture, but only the lecture, not the question and answers. It's a great pleasure for me to have today Nadine Löhr. She's a doctoral researcher at the project Biblioteca Arabica. The project is based, as you may know, in the Saxon Academy of Sciences and Humanities in Leipzig, in Germany. And she's also a cataloger in Arabic for Arabic manuscript for the project Ptolemeus Arabus et Latinus in the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities. She also a researcher associated with the Communities of Knowledge at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, where she has studied networks of Arabic books and manuscripts. The outcome of this research will be published soon in a forthcoming issue of the Medieval Wars journal that we edit here at the Academy. Overall, Nadine's research focuses on the dissemination and transmission of Arabic manuscripts on astral sciences in particular. And today she will be speaking about astronomy in the Ilkhanate, the early manuscript tradition of al-Tusi, Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī. Nadine, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I will briefly share my screen and start the presentation. So I hope you can all see the slides. Today's talk will be about the manuscript tradition, the early manuscript tradition of Tusi's Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī, which is the most prominent commentary that was produced on the Almagest in the Arabic-speaking world, and it had major impact on the general development and study of astronomy in the Islamic world, as well as on the manuscript transmission. There are many libraries which today hold collections and single exemplars of these manuscripts. And if we take a look at the general outline, you'll find that most of them are even today in Iran, where we also gathered a lot of copies from the Ptolemeus Arabus et Latinus team in Munich. And you can imagine that this is a project where many people have contributed to. There are overall more than 170 manuscripts which comprise this work. And we have been working on this for several years. I started only later contributing to this. There are already numerous descriptions of these manuscripts by José Belver, as well as Maria José Parra Pérez, whose work I continued. If you want to have a look at the current state of the manuscripts and the descriptions, there's a beta version online on the Ptolemeus Arabus et Latinus webpage, or an article by Maria José Parra Pérez in which she mentioned and described about 100 of these manuscripts. And she also goes into detail, mentioning that there is a certain set of appendices that appears in some of the early manuscripts and is also transmitted in some of the later manuscripts. She, in general, divides between a type A and a type B in the dissemination, where in a type A, we would have manuscripts that appear without the 3 additional works. I will later say a little more about that. And a type B of manuscripts which comprise the 3 additional works. Before I go more into detail about my general scope of today, which is to describe the dissemination of the marginal annotations and their impact, I would like to say a few words about the work itself and the amount of copies we have, as well as in general impact and the transmission. You may see here, again, those are the collections from which we can notice that most manuscripts copies are extant. Overall, I mentioned Iran, especially the collection in Tehran comprise alone 42 manuscripts of the about 170 that have so far been identified, but the number will likely still keep growing a bit because there are several collections that have not been investigated thoroughly because we are lacking catalogs, for example. This is especially true for the Maghreb. If we take a look at the earliest manuscripts that were produced, those are, you can even see how they become disseminated. Earliest copy extant is from Marara, where the observatory was and where the copy was studied extensively. And then we noticed that in other cities through which also the work was transmitted through students of Tusi and students of al-Shirazi, who was the most prominent student of Nasiruddin Tusi, who himself became a prominent astronomer. He traveled, for example, to Sivas, to Baghdad, and those are the manuscripts that also have close relation to the copies by him. The work is also extant in Persian translations. Here the work is known as Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī by a certain Hayla Lutfullah, who was an engineer from Lahore and can actually be identified as the grandson or one of the grandsons of the architect of the Taj Mahal in India. And this is, for example, one screenshot of the Persian version of the text. There are also extant several manuscripts in Sanskrit. This is an Arabic version that was acquired by the Maharaja Jai Singh. I'm sorry if the pronunciation is wrong. He bought this manuscript in 1725, and this was possibly, or maybe even likely, the template on which the later Sanskrit version is based. The translator of the Sanskrit version also, just as a side note, translated the elements of Nasiruddin Tusi into Sanskrit. There are several super commentaries that have been produced, and so far we found about 7. The 2 most prominent ones of these are by Nizamuddin Hasan al-Nīsābūrī, which was produced in the late 13th century. Here you see in brackets roughly the time where the astronomers were active. Al-Birjandī composed another commentary, and these 2 commentaries are extant in most copies. The one by Nīsābūrī in about 50 copies, and the copies of al-Birjandī Sharh Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī amount to about 32. If you would like to roughly sketch when these witnesses were produced, it's interesting to note that we see a peak around 1050 Hijri, which corresponds to roughly 1640 in the Gregorian calendar, and is falling into the period of the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas II, who is well known to have supported the development and further dissemination and study of astronomical sciences. This is only a very rough sketch now. It's based on the catalog data we have, as well as the manuscripts that I could inspect, but of course it has to be treated with caution, since there are also guesses included which have been made by the catalogers, from Iranian catalogs, for example. And then it excludes, of course, all the copies that were produced and do not contain a date. If we take a look at one of the most prominent commentaries that was produced on the Taḥrīr, which then becomes a super commentary to the Almagest, we see that the development is similar. So in comparison to the Almagest commentaries, the uncommented commentaries, which appear to have been replaced by the increasing amount of Taḥrīr copies, this does not happen with later super commentaries. They rather appear to be studied next to the text, which then is also reflected in the manuscript copies, where we often find marginal annotations by al-Nīsābūrī, which shows that at that time people had both texts at hand. And we see again around 1050, there's a peak in the manuscript production. Of course, we have to consider that there is also a loss and transmission of manuscripts. It looks a bit different if we take a look at al-Birjandī's commentary, but nonetheless, also this commentary was studied. Here it's even more difficult to say something about it, because now we are talking about very few copies that are actually dated. But taking a look at the manuscripts of this commentary, we notice that there are barely any marginal annotations, and if it's possible to judge on that, the text was not studied so much together with other texts, and maybe not read so much in schools or astronomical teaching institutions. Now, just putting a focus on what I would like to emphasize today, the marginal annotations. We take a look at the copies that were produced in the Ilkhanate in the early time, and take a general look at how they have developed over time and how often they appear. First of all, as an introduction, I would like to point out that there seems to be a development in how Nasiruddin at-Tusi designs the layout of his manuscripts, and I believe that this starts happening in the citadel of Alamut, where he also produced the commentary, his prominent commentary on the Taḥrīr. So here you see what is left of the once glorious citadel of Alamut, of the Ismāʿīlīs, in which also Tusi studied and translated texts. One of the texts that was produced here, you see the date, is our commentary of today, the recension of the Almagest, which in itself is not only using one source. We know that he mostly worked with the translation that was produced by Ḥunayn ibn Isḥāq and corrected by Thābit ibn Qurra, but he also incorporated other manuscripts and sources, other translations even. There is a translation by al-Hajjaj from the Greek, which he quotes extensively throughout the main text of that source, as well as in the margins. We'll talk about this a little later. And a translation that is attributed to Thābit ibn Qurra, on which Dirk Gruppe worked. Here, our work is attributed and dedicated to Nadine Muhammad as-Siwasi, who probably was an official, Ismāʿīlī official, but it's very difficult to find information about him. For some time, depending on, because there was a wrong attribution of manuscripts to Siwasi, there was the impression that once a commentary existed written by him, which is actually just a problem that goes back to the catalogs, and that then Setskin incorporated in his history of Arabic literature, and that was then spread. So, but either way, so Hussam ad-Din as-Siwasi is the dedicatee of this work. And if we take a look at how the texts that were produced in Alamut looked like, we see that suddenly at-Tusi uses red ink not only to highlight important parts of his texts, but to actually transfer specific information and meaning. And I think this has a didactical purpose. To give one example, we have here on the left an index which appears in the Safinat al-Ahkam, which is one work that is an astrological compilation that uses several other sources. And in the beginning of this work, he states an indice with all the books that were accessible to him in the Alamut castle and which he used to produce this treatise. And there he gives specific sigla to each of those works that he will then cite throughout the treatise. I have on the right-hand side here the transcription and in my interpretation. It's so far still work in progress, my interpretation of these sigla. And it's interesting to see then in the text that he uses these red letters to give the information about the other sources and books that he used. He also gives in the introduction of the Safinat al-Ahkam fragments of, it's more extracts of other works from which he quotes muqaddimas, introductions and prefaces, and explicitly says that he now wants to highlight what is important of the prefaces mentioned in the other works. So he puts an emphasis on how works are introduced, how mathematical works should be introduced. And if we take a look now at the muqaddimah of the Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī, he, for example, highlights that he intends to simplify difficult passages, to offer solutions to doubt, to include what the moderns, so the later astronomers of Ptolemy, have invented or what has been adapted by other astronomers to make it more elegant or easy to understand the text, because after all, the Taḥrīr was meant to be studied by students and as an aid as well as a reference work. And then he also mentions, he highlighted in color the lines and numbers of diagrams which he added. This is another point that I would like to emphasize. So here again, we have another work that he produced, he produced during his stay with the Ismāʿīlīs, where he makes extensive use of the use of color. And if we take a look at the text, we can easily notice that you see here on the right-hand side, the translation of the Arabic version of the translation of Ḥunayn bin Isḥāq with the corrections by Thābit ibn Qurra. And on the left-hand side, the Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī by Tusi. And here he gives in red the figures which he took directly from this Almagest translation, and the figures which he added have a different color setting. So here he switched the colors. Those have red geometrical points and black lines. And if you scroll through the manuscripts in general, you will notice that this is throughout his work, he uses this kind of system to differentiate between the figures that he borrowed or the figures that he used directly from the Isḥāq Thābit translation, and later additions by other versions or commentaries are in this black line and red geometrical number system. Another thing that we notice is here on the right-hand side, you see Arabic letters. It's abjad notation that counts and is used as a reference to the individual diagrams, which then function as some sort of subchapter system. And he uses this notation in the margins to make it easier for students to find the right sections in the text. And this is different in manuscripts from other genres in the Arabic literature. We usually don't have chapter numbers or book numbers in the margin that would make it easier to find the text. Instead, you would use a different system like catchwords, for example. And my general idea of where this might come from is that it could have been transmitted through the Greek manuscripts. You see here, which on the left-hand side, which I believe is the oldest Greek manuscript of the Almagest. It's from the 9th century, and in the left, you see the Greek numbering system also in the margin. This is chapter 9 of book 1 of the Almagest, and on the right, you see again our Tunis manuscript, which features the translation by Ḥunayn and Thābit ibn Qurra. Just in addition to this, Tusi takes this to another extent. So here we only have the book numbers and chapter numbers that are used in the margins. Tusi uses even sub-chapters, emphasizes them in red color. And it seems to me that the system is then taking over in the setting of the Marara studies. And it's also applied throughout several other works that he wrote, such as the Mutawassitat, a collection of astronomical, mathematical, smaller books that are compiled to make it easier for the students to study this text. And in that manner, he incorporates the new system into his studies. We can observe that through the commentary literature, then it starts slowly to disappear. The student of al-Shirazi, Nīsābūrī, still uses the system, but then at least in the later centuries of al-Birjandī, it disappears again, and the chapter and sub-chapter numbers in the margins are not used anymore as aid to read this book as a reference book. Here's another example where Tusi uses red ink to highlight specific differences and use color not only as color for headings and beginnings of chapters, but to convey specific information. You can see here in the margin, there's the note that the annotations which are written in red are taken from a copy in the hand of Abiri Khan. This is al-Biruni. And if I think I have a close-up here. Yeah, you can see that the variant readings are in red, which makes it then easier to spot. Why am I putting so much emphasis on the colors? One of the reasons is that I would like to talk now about Hashia notes that appear in the very early manuscripts. And I believe that these have to be treated as part of the main text. You see here, just to give you a few examples, what kind of notes these are and what they look like. They are highlighted in the majority of early manuscripts in red, where it says red hashia. In Arabic, hashia has several meanings. It can be a gloss, marginal annotation, but at the same time, it is also used as a word for a commentary. Sonia Brentius has shown that the word, however, appears in titles of commentaries only much later. So here we are not talking about extracts from a commentary, but really about annotations and glosses in the margins, which use the same phrasing and system as Tusi applies in the main text. You see in the middle, for example, a note to book 7, where it says, where we have a reference to a copy to a Syriac copy. In general, these notes have different purpose. Many of them refer to other copies of the Almagest, like here in the left upper corner, note to book 2, reference to a copy by Thābit, fi nuskha Thābit, or below that is a little addition that's supposed to make a diagram more clear in a description of a diagram. And on the right-hand side, again, a note to book 7. Here is a quote by al-Nīsābūrī, who, according to the secondary sources, produced a commentary on the Almagest, which has not survived. But we have this quote, for example, which is transmitted in the same style, and which gives us a hint at where the glosses might stem from. And as many of the early manuscripts mentioned that the Hashia note were already extant in the base manuscript, it's quite likely that these actually might derive from Tusi himself. What kind of notes do we have? So here I summarized again in more detail the different editions that are described as Hashia notes. There are minor differences in the early manuscripts, but overall we have a specific set of annotations, or you may even call it scholia, that are transmitted in several manuscripts. I believe that then some shift may have occurred in the transmission. There are few notes that apparently by the students are perceived not only as Hashia notes that should go as some sort of footnote system with the text, but notes that have a revision purpose and that are approved. That are approved by the author. Here on the right-hand side, you see this is a screenshot from a manuscript held in Hagia Sophia, and at the end of this manuscript, we find a note that the text was, on the one hand, this note contains information that the text was collated in the Madrasa Khafarsiya in Nishapur, and that the collator was Muhammad bin Uthman, a student of al-Shirazi, who compared the text to a manuscript that was corrected and read in the presence of the author. And then the student complains a bit about the harsh circumstances at the book market and that they had to stop copying processes in order to, because he couldn't say books couldn't be sold. And this is then followed by appraisal of his master, al-Shirazi. This note conveys information that may remind us of the Tazkira tradition. And the Tazkira tradition, on the work of the Tazkira, prominently, the Atusi produced a second text version was produced. There's one text version from Baghdad, which is perceived as the unrevised text version, and a later text version that was produced at a later point, and that is based on corrections which were made in the margins by students, prominently also al-Shirazi, who read again the copy to the master Atusi shortly before his death, and that led to a second text version. It is my impression that we don't have two text versions of the Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī, but what certainly happens is that students believe that these notes are important and that they should be added to the text. So they added them in red on top of as interlinear annotations. Some of these notes are also of a different nature. They are more like explanations, so it's clear that they were not meant to go into the main text. This manuscript here on the left, Istanbul Topkapi, is a collection of several texts where we have, on the one hand, these sort of annotations that students believed were some sort of revisions included in the text. And this text version, I'm hoping it's not getting too complicated now, but al-Shirazi produced a copy later on, and it seems that he did not incorporate these annotations, but that the students were more interested in that, or that they interpreted it in a wrong way and incorporated it for that reason. So this is another point that probably shows that there were not two text versions intended by Atusi. What we can tell about the afterlife of these notes is quite interesting. For example, we have this note that was mentioned before with a reference to a lost commentary by al-Nīsābūrī. This is again the Topkapi copy, and it's clearly to read here that it says Qal al-Nīsābūrī. However, in later manuscripts, the Nīsābūrī turns into al-Tabrīsī. And this is probably one of the nightmares of a researcher. Finally, we are happy to find annotations that are attributed to a specific author and note that, or it's difficult to note in retrospective, but that the quote is actually wrong because it clearly that's not al-Tabrīsī but al-Nīsābūrī. And we noticed this in a number of later manuscripts that the name was misread and turned into al-Tabrīsī. It's probably a reminder of the fact that we should always go back to the early copies and compare that. Another thing that changes is that the later copies do not include the hashia anymore, that we still have in red on the left-hand side on top of the text. where some of the manuscripts still said in the beginning that the Hashia was part of the base texts, and al-Birjandī is even aware of the fact that those were meant to be part of the text and treats them as such, and he believes that they stem from Tusi and incorporates some of them in the main text. So one of the questions that may arise is, why do some of these annotations make it into the later commentaries and are transmitted for longer periods where others don't? Interestingly, those annotations that refer to other copies, I mean, this is a very prominent now, this is probably the most prominent annotation that we find to the Taḥrīr. It appears in the beginning and summarizes how many copies exist of the Almagest translations, or sorry, how many different translations exist. So that was clearly perceived as very important. What was also included very often are the short references that mention that a specific copy had, a Thābit's copy, for example, had a different system of more figures and a different system of chapters, which is sometimes indicated in the margins. Yeah, but I don't know much about this text, so maybe you rather want to seek for Dirk Gruppe's articles on that. In what disappears very quickly from the annotations, and these are not necessarily Hashia annotations, but I believe that they stem from the Marara setting, are annotations in a different language or script system. Here is a note that is clearly Syriac or stems from Syriac. It might have been corrupted over time. That is extant in a copy that was copied in Marara. And another manuscript that is directly based on this copy and was copied very, the scribe was very diligent in copying this manuscript, but excludes this kind of annotations. They were, however, very likely already extant in the early time and not added at a later point. A similar situation occurs in a manuscript that is now extant in a microfilm in Tehran, where we have Greek annotations to a book, and we also have copies to that manuscript, but the Greek annotations are not transmitted, which is probably obvious if students didn't understand the script system, that they would exclude this kind of annotations, which unfortunately then over time get lost in the transmission. Other copies that, other annotations that did not make it into later manuscripts are references to specific scribes. I mean, this one is a reference to a figure that is different in the manuscripts of al-Urdi. Al-Urdi was one of the most prominent astronomers working in Al-Marara, and this annotation is still extant in few of the early manuscripts, which also served as exemplars for later manuscripts, but is then not transmitted anymore. And it's clearly why. I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about technical details here because I'm more concerned with codicological aspects and I'm not a mathematician. But if I understand this correctly, there's just a mistake in the manuscript and the diagram or the figure was drawn in a wrong way. So the marginal annotation is more of a correction than actually something that's different in the manuscripts of al-Urdi. It just happens to be correct in al-Urdi's manuscript. Yeah, I mentioned that the Syriac and Greek notes are left, as well as specific notes by authors. Another aspect which we would like to observe are longer additions and proofs that appear in manuscripts. This is, for example, a proof that is also mentioned in the recently published article by Tarumi. It's very common in the Arabic Almagest commentary tradition. In this case here, the proof stems from Ali al-Samsati, who appears in many of the early manuscripts. However, it's difficult to find information on this student or astronomer. He apparently did not produce any bigger works that survived, and I haven't found other information on him. However, we have several notes that are attributed to him, and for example, this proof that also makes it in a more simplified manner into the commentary tradition by Samarkandi and al-Nīsābūrī. There is the reference to Taḥrīr article if you are interested in that. But in any case, this is a proof that appears in one or the other way in many manuscripts on the Almagest tradition. But knowing that this was often transmitted together with the Taḥrīr makes it likely that later commentators perceived it as an important factor to include in the manuscripts. Another thing that we may notice, and here I put the example of Qutb ad-Din al-Shirazi's own copy, which is extant in the Nur-Usmaniya manuscript. This is in his own hand and comprises 3 smaller works, which I mentioned before, also described by Maria José Parra-Pérez. These appear in many manuscripts in exactly this order. The first proof, the first edition is a letter which is devoted to the computation of the centers of the spheres of Mercury. The second is a sort of introduction, which is also devoted to the computation of the anomaly caused by the eccentricity. And the last in the series is an addition or explanation to a geometrical figure on Venus. There's one thing, I mean, we encounter this a lot in exactly this order, the 3 little works added to the manuscripts, especially in the early tradition. I checked several commentaries. It appears as if these works have not made it into the commentary tradition, and that includes also the last one on the figure of Venus, which I believe we should maybe treat in a little different way. This is a manuscript that was actually copied by, or as I believe, there has been sent out in the past, but I'm grateful to conversations with Boris Liebrands I had about this manuscript, and again checking colophons and annotations, that it's relatively clear that this manuscript was copied by the son of Mu'ayyad al-Urdi. And you see here, this is an explanation, an addition that is inserted on a separate leaf, and it's written in the same hand as the main text. So the son of the prominent astronomer al-Urdi. Sorry, if I said before it's from al-Urdi, I meant it's his son Shamsuddin al-Urdi. It was produced in 670 Hijri, and what's interesting is that this is the first occurrence of one of the appendices in a manuscript where we can actually date the edition. And it's only the part that in Shirazi's manuscripts is the third work that is added to the text. Here it appears in an isolated case, and it does not include the diagram, which it should include. It doesn't, would be very useful to have the diagram with this. And it's interesting to note that this happens also in other early manuscripts. There is, for example, here I put as a proof, you can see that it's the same text. On the bottom, it's the text of al-Shirazi in his hand, and on top, the copy of the Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī by Mu'ayyad ad-Din al-Urdi's son. And the same appears to happen also in the Tehran Sifar Salah manuscript, which is an early copy and includes on an extra leaf the proof of, or the addition on the figure of Venus without the other appendices. And then again, Istanbul Murat Molla is directly copied from that. So the same occurs here. I'm in general wondering, I mean, I'm sharing with you my thought process here, since I'm working as a research assistant in the project. I'm collecting information I can find on the manuscripts while describing the manuscripts for the catalog, and I notice certain things. So my general idea is, if we have to perceive these three editions in a separate way. On the one hand, we have the explanation of the figure of Venus, which is added the first time in that copy of al-Urdi's son, and then appears at a later stage in Shirazi's manuscripts at the end, with two other shorter works added. This collection of the three works is extant in a variety of manuscripts that all go back to students of Shirazi or Shirazi himself. This manuscript we see here is the copy in his hand, which he produced in 686, and other manuscripts that are transmitted through his students mention another copy that was done by al-Shirazi at an earlier point, but also these manuscripts transmit the three editions, which strengthens our interpretation that maybe all these editions were produced, or at least disseminated, through a Tusi's student al-Shirazi, and not so much produced by Tusi himself. It's still difficult to figure the situation, because al-Shirazi himself based his copies on a Tusi's autograph. However, the fact that we have several autograph copies, several copies that go directly back to a Tusi's autograph, among which is the one in Tehran Sefer Salah, as well as a copy extant in the Majlis library, and two copies, one copy in Istanbul Rajab. These are all based on Tusi's autograph, but do not contain the three additions to the work. Another reason why I believe this is that we should pay attention to the dissemination of the work through the Mutawassitat. There are some manuscripts which comprise this collection together with a Tusi's elements and the Almagest. So it's a big collection of work. The Mutawassitat are many small works that deal with astronomy, mathematics, geometry. I have here an index of all the works that are comprised in the collection of Ahmed III, 3453. Many of these works are very short, and they are intended to be studied between the elements. So after students study the elements of Euclid, and before they start studying the Almagest, they would need additional material to grasp the text properly. So it was intended to be studied with these texts. However, only in the 13th century we notice collections which comprise the Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī together with the Mutawassitat. In other manuscripts, the Mutawassitat are a separate collection, because it's clear you need a very big manuscript to comprise all these texts. And what is interesting now is that in our copy from 672, this text was copied in Baghdad as well as in Sivas, where the Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī is part of the text, but does not comprise the three appendices. However, in later versions, we find also these collections together with the with the Taḥrīr al-Majisṭī, here you see a list of an index of the works that are comprised in the collection. In the last row on the right-hand side, al-Majisṭī, here it's clearly the Taḥrīr, but sometimes the authors would only write Almagest, since the study of the Taḥrīr clearly replaced the study of the Almagest itself, and the work was likewise treated. Is followed by mention of one of the appendices, and on top of this, if we zoom in a little better, we see that this collection specifically is transmitted again through al-Shirāzi, and this further, I believe, strengthens our point that the manuscripts which comprise the appendices appear to be transmitted through al-Shirāzi and his students, whereas those which do not comprise the appendices and in many cases go back to an autograph copy are based on Tusi's, I may call it version now maybe. However, we need to be careful, because even if it appears as if all the three works always come as an entity, even in the early manuscript tradition, we notice that the version that discusses the figure of Venus, for example, is already in the very early manuscripts and through al-Urdi's son transmitted in a separate manuscript. Yeah, so this is just to give you an idea about the things I've been thinking about. I'm very happy for questions. If you want to seek further texts or secondary literature on this, I give you recommendations here if anyone's interested. And yeah, thank you for your attention.